Hey guys, what's up? I'm back once again to talk about some discourse in the community. This time I'm trying to talk about power rankings in the FGC. Recently there's been some feathers getting ruffled over the concept because of 9moons, a TO and sponsor organization in the Strive community. Seriously, these guys are really great, make sure to check them out if you haven't. I honestly support 9moons and everything they're up to, generally speaking. Regardless of your opinion on the power ranking, these guys have been doing great things for the community since they started. With that out of the way, there are some things I could stand to disagree with conceptually about power rankings, so I figured that I'd try to break down the pros and cons in a neat little video for you guys. To start with, what is a power ranking? Well, a power ranking's intent is generally to rank the strongest players of a game's community onto a leaderboard, in order to essentially suss out who's the absolute best players. Since 9moons is the most recent example, we'll talk about their method. I pulled this from their tweets, so I might get the exact process a little incorrect, in which case, feel free to correct me in the comments. They plan on using panelists to analyze tournament data from online and offline brackets from the period of July 1st to February 6th, essentially encompassing the following offline majors: CEO, EVO, CEO Taku, Frosty Faustings, with some offline and high online level tournaments between them, such as 9moons weekly and monthly, the TNS tournament, and assumably Series E exhibitions and tournaments like that. Once the panelists have assembled their votes, the top and bottom of the lists are chopped away, then the results are aggregated for a list of 50 players. The panelists aren't required to list their players solely by results. Rather, the results are meant to guide and not command the rankings, allowing panelists to interpret these results in a manner they see fit. Of course, the panelists aren't allowed to rank themselves. So, what's good about this? Well, there are a few things. A power ranking can be a good venue for sponsors to quickly see who is performing highly in net play and majors. It gives top players a handy number to advertise in player cards and profiles for sponsors to see. This lets sponsors quickly pick up free agents, especially after a good season or after they overtake key players in the power ranking. They can provide motivation for players to improve their play and see their little funny number go higher. People may feel incentivized more by the ability to get recognized, even if they don't necessarily win the entire bracket or make the payout. When they beat X-ranked player, they might feel more impressed with themselves than if they had won otherwise. Additionally, it can help fuel the stories for brackets. Player rivalries, chances for one player to overtake another in the power ranking, etc. creates a buzz for events and adds to the spectator element. It can bring light to lesser known players or give them a celebratory nod, even if they aren't exactly the #1 player or winning every bracket. When people see a bunch of top ranked players in the same bracket together, people will get excited. Finally, it provides a useful tool for tournament organizers to quickly look at established players with recent placings and then seed them in their brackets. All of these can be pretty good arguments for generating a power ranking and keeping up with it. Not to mention the organization that makes it gains clout points for becoming the established authority. People will look to them more as an educational resource for the game. Getting top players and tournament organizers involved can add to that air of authority around the power rankings and help your legitimacy. If you produce a good product at the end of the road, then it's a guaranteed boost for yourself and your circle of influence, as well as all the people you had involved. But that does lead to some pretty big problems. The first one that I can think of is data sampling bias. Picking and choosing which tournaments count is a process which adds a human element to your ranking that becomes a bias. Even with a numbers-only approach, you still have to choose the numbers. It's unrealistic to capture every data point, which leads to arbitrary differences in what is counted and what isn't. For example, Tong's rankings. I chose a random high-ranked player and examined their data entries. What was curious to me is that some brackets in their list have less entrants than regionals that I personally have participated in, containing at least some players who have done well internationally. This isn't an inherent problem with the list necessarily. The argument might be that the players at those events, for example, were significantly higher rated than the ones at my events. Simply, I'm just saying that you do end up having to pick and choose, which means the lines across which you pick and choose will end up being inherently biased. The second thing I can think of is panel bias. The panel itself adds an inherent bias that can only be perceived as worse depending on who you put in the panel. Humans are simply biased after all. You can end up incriminating yourself if your panel consists of top players who have a vested interest in being on the list themselves, or want to maintain their appearances for their content creation and community, maintain sponsors, or gain sponsors entirely, as well as organizers and members of organizations who have a vested interest in their players being on the list. This helps them represent their brand and wield clout. In general, you also have a myriad of other problems with the human element, such as panelists simply not liking or taking seriously other high caliber players or having a running history with them. So the best picks you could possibly have in your panel are generally going to be unaffiliated with any branding or organization, at least the ones that are relevant to your panel/power ranking. This means generally you'll want to have commentators and TOs who are not a part of a larger org. But ultimately, by creating a panel at all, you've already decided to add an extra inherent bias to your results. To me personally, the perception that panelists are biased is, well, a non-starter. Of course they are. They're people. They can just do their best to be impartial while creating their lists, but you have to accept that some level of bias is okay if you're creating the panel in the first place. The next problem that I can think of is location bias. I sort of coined this phrase while thinking about the problem because I'm not sure what the real-world stat term for it would be. This one is similar to data sampling bias, but it occurs because of the players, not because of the panelists necessarily. While your panelists may largely come from one area of the country and this affects their bias, that's part of the panel itself. What I'm more talking about is simply this. The largest density of events is on the East Coast, similar to the density of players in the country. This means that the East Coast is naturally more visible than the West Coast, affecting the data that you gather for your rankings. This compounds with the fact that travel for East Coast players will then be cheaper because most of the events will be on their side of the country, meaning that players of equal skill with West Coast players will be able to attend more events, in turn allowing them to accumulate points and results for the power ranking that West Coasters will simply not have access to without sponsored funding, this being a statistically unlikely prospect for most players. While this problem may have no solution ultimately, it does feed into a lot of the other issues you see with how power rankings can be structured. Less West Coast events means lower West Coast players, means West Coast gets ranked lower, and ultimately East Coast events get perceived as better, which enables the cycle onward and onward. Finally, burnout and demotivation can be an issue as well. Just as well as you can see the increase in motivation, generation of rivalries, etc., you can also do the reverse. Players may be hyped up by the buzz of next season's power rankings, or they might see the results of their efforts and their ego get bruised by having their results be attributed to a number, or perhaps not earning a number at all. Players can use these numbers in negative ways to dismiss players and their opinions. When you make incentives highly results focused without highlighting the community improvement in other ways, players who are up and coming may feel left behind over time, or feel like they will never catch up. You can just look how rating update impacted people's opinion about other players in the game itself to see what could happen to giving players a number. And it's easy to say, well, just shift your mental, buck up. And this is kind of true, right? But the reality is that creating these as, celebratory or for hype will inevitably incur this effect on many people in the scene. When your goal isn't just to create a tool, but to invoke emotion in the community, then you'll inevitably evoke the wrong emotions as well. So then, what do we do? Before I talk about it, I do want to point out that it's not all doom and gloom. I do like things in the rankings I've seen so far. The first is transparency in the process. 9moons has provided quite a bit of feedback to players, spectators, and other onlookers on their process. They encourage the process to be shown live. I think this is a great idea, as it not only provides good content to hear the thoughts of high-tier players and analysts, but it also lets us peer into their lists and the reasons for their placements. It helps us better understand their aims, and if we disagree, walk away. The next is that their method of obtaining 50-player lists is pretty solid. Taking the aggregate of a larger list and cutting out the top and bottom picks helps alleviate a bit of the bias and will make for a generally pretty accurate median, roughly the 30 to 50 spots on the list. They've also been very receptive and open to critique and criticism, answering my questions and several others. This is a good thing. It signals that 9moons genuinely wants good for the community and wants it to grow, which is something I've always seen from them as an organization. It shows good faith in the process and their willingness to grow into future power rankings and panels. So with that, let's talk about a few ways that we could improve the process. In my opinion, there's a couple processes you could follow to make the power ranking different and try to alleviate these problems. Unfortunately, power rankings with panels carry an extreme amount of bias. This is just the natural state of affairs from adding more and more human elements to your product. The way to resolve this is by making your power rankings numbers focused. If you make your rankings exclusively based on numbers and results, then at least there is no ambiguity to why someone was ranked the way they were. The numbers are just there. A player or spectator may disagree with that number, sure, but those are just the numbers. When you have panelists inserting their thoughts and feelings, it becomes a legitimate excuse for people to create doubt in your power rankings. Personally, I wouldn't bother with it. You might argue that this removes the hype or sterilizes the list, but in my opinion, you can't attempt to create a tool and also attempt to have it be a subjective, emotive content generator for the community. Those two functions simply don't really mix well in my mind, and they kind of undermine each other, right? The other thing you could do if your intent was to generate buzz, hype, or celebrate player progress is to tier the players rather than directly ranking them. Separate players into tier 0, tier 1, A tier, S tier, whatever method you'd like. But rather than attributing players to number 1 through 50, you could group and generalize, talking about each player and their placement and why. Play off the subjectivity of it all, so to speak, and this creates an engagement factor with the audience of your ranking without attempting to falsely present them as entirely objective, when they simply can't be. And while having player perspective is important, I think that being selective in your choices can help a lot. While I personally like all of the players they chose for their panel, it could have been a bit simpler for 9moons to select strong players who simply won't appear on the list. For example, players who haven't played in majors or or net play often or at all in the period that you're looking to rank for. Coming to mind specifically is Romola, who already has a presence in the community as a thoughtful, high-skilled player who provides analysis in the community. Another is Snake Eyes, who would have had very interesting takes from the perspective of a player who refuses to enter any tournaments in the scene. Finally, you could regionalize your power rankings rather than making them a national affair. This alleviates some problems inherent to West Coast having more spread out player populations and less events, since they can be recognized regardless of their inability to make the sheer number of events that East Coast players do by their proximity. Some scenes already do this, for example with Denise points being an extremely popular power ranking in the PNW. It's only numbers based, and it's based off attendance of events and who you played against. So rather than having a panel, you simply list out the events that you attended in the region and the offline events that you've attended internationally or nationally, and then rank each player according to their results. And generally speaking, it helps generate a lot of hype. People feel very happy about this power ranking, despite the fact that it's simply numbers based. And it's probably because it's simply an objective, completely numbers based way to uplift players in the PNW scene. But ultimately, in my opinion, whatever you decide to take from these new power rankings or any of the power rankings that are in your scene, my biggest piece of advice to you is this: a number doesn't define you as a player. Your ability to improve, or your improvements thus far, are not changed just because you didn't reach an arbitrary threshold for a random group of panelists and their completely subjective opinions. Strive, yeah, bad joke, to do better and take it in stride as best as you can. If you do get ranked, so be it, great job. And if not, just prove them wrong. As always, I appreciate you watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what kind of systems you'd like to see, or none if that's how you feel. And be sure to like and sub if you like the content. It may just be a couple clicks for you, but really it does mean a lot to me. Till next time, catch you guys later.